All Arabs were barbarians. They used to kill their daughters. They used to eat carrion. They would marry willy-nilly, left, right, and center. They would marry their mothers, their mother-in-laws. They would seek vengeance, and
they were illiterate.
They were illiterate. They were utter barbarians, right?
So there was nothing in Arabia. This was a backwater, complete barbaric society. They were killing daughters. They had nothing going for them. Maybe they were a bit kind of, they knew poetry. They're good to guess. They were chivalrous. But aside from that, there's no civilization. These people are not civilized at all. Would that be a fair?
They would have you believe that the only two redeeming qualities that the Arabs had was, one was their poetry and the second was their generosity and nobility. That was it. Yeah. Right? Yes. So there was nothing there. There was no prior civilization. Had they only read Roman and Greek historical texts, they would have known how much of a civilization there was actually there in those areas. So, it's like the antithesis. So, we are Muslims, we are people of light, and the exact opposite of us was darkness, barbarianism, Jahiliyyah, ignorance, eating of carrion and killing, which I still haven't understood, by the way, eating of carrion, and burying our daughters, which wasn't as widespread as they would have you believe, and all of these sort of things. So it's a quick brush, to kind of wash away what you don't know and say, okay, well, now listen to what I do know, which is the narrative of the seerah, which is only on the religious level. See, most people would have you believe that it was a blank canvas, and I unfortunately fell into that as well, because when I studied seerah, not much is mentioned about the past or the society, and then I was left with huge gaps. I was thinking, okay, so was this a virgin land? Was this a barren land? Nothing really is being mentioned. It was only when I studied antiquity, late antiquity, and prehistory that I realized, no, it was teeming with life. And not only was it teeming with life, there was a plethora of religions there. So, for example, in the south, we have like Mecca and its environs, you can say it was pagan. But for sure, we had Christians in Mecca. For sure, we probably had a few Jews in Mecca. We had Zoroastrians in Mecca. So ideas were being exchanged. So there goes your blank canvas theory, which Yasir Qadhi postulated, right? And you've got in the south, all the way up to Yemen, it's Christian, right? Najran is a famous Christian city.
Yes.
The story of the ditch in the Quran, referring to the Christians, it's that area. And then as you go into Yemen proper, you've got Christians and now Jews, right? So then now let's go up. From Mecca, you got Medina. Medina is Jewish, predominantly a Jewish town. The Jews held majority power alongside pagan Arabs. And then go into Khaybar, that was Jewish. Al-Ula, that was Jewish. Didan, that was most probably Jewish. Taima, that was Jewish. Tabuk was Jewish. Going all the way up into the Levant was now Jewish settlements, right? So most people don't know that. They just think, oh yeah, it was pagan. No, you were surrounded by, so everybody kind of knew each other's ideas. So one person who was teaching seerah, I'm not going to mention his name, he says that one of the Orientalists pick a point that the Quran is referring to Christian ideas and Christian themes very early on. His answer is that Allah knew what He was doing. In the future, they were going to convert, so this is for the future generations. Okay. Right? Now, where did you get that from? My analysis teaches me that the reason the Quran was referring to Christians very early on is there were Christians present there already.
Is this not a mystery? It's not a mystery. I mean, we had the Ghassanid Empire, literally, in the northern territories, who were allies or vassals to the Byzantine emperor. The Ghassanid kings were known. In fact, in Medina, they were one of the major threats. Banu Ghassan, they were Christian Arabs, completely Christianized. Then you had on the other side Al-Lakhm, who were also Christian, but were allied to the Sassanid Empire, a mixture. But the point is, Christianity amongst the Arabs before Islam should not be a strange thing. We had literal kingdoms in the peninsula surrounding that were Christians and they were Arabs. And as you mentioned, in the southern regions of Himyar, which was Jewish, and you had Najran, Christian. None of this was strange. So it shouldn't be really it's not an anomaly to find early references to Christianity, but it is kind of, when you have the blank canvas hypothesis, it causes a problem. Why would you say, why is it important for us to have that blank canvas hypothesis that there was nothing in Arabia and then Islam came and everything? Why is that important, that narrative? What does it serve, in fact?
Right, two reasons. First reason is it's very easy for any Islamic sheikh giving a lecture who doesn't know his history to say, oh yeah, blank canvas, everything was blank. So I'm going to tell you how it was. It started with Nabuwah, the birth of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and the 40 years was paganism. Then boom, Islam hit and light. That's it. It's very easy to say that. It's very, very easy for Islamic scholars to say that because they don't have the knowledge to know what came before. And the second reason why it's nice to say that is that this ties in with Jahiliyyah, right? Now, Jahiliyyah is a very complex subject. It can be summed up in one statement, but we've made it into a very complex subject, trying to really understand what Jahiliyyah meant. Jahiliyyah, for over various times, for various civilizations, for various people, up to the present day Orientalists, means a plethora of different things, right? So, I mean, it's a fruitless argument. It doesn't serve any purpose. But if you're inclined that way, and you're academically inclined, you could look into it. It means many, many things, but we'll sum it up in a bit in what it really means. So all of a sudden, when Islam comes, it's like Islam took the Arabs out of the Dark Ages. There was nothing before worth mentioning, even though there was.
There was
Islam
no
took you out.
Sorry to this. I'm going to just play the angel's advocate here. So there was nothing in Arabia. This was a backwater, complete barbaric society. They were killing daughters. They had nothing going for them. Maybe they were a bit kind of, they knew poetry. They were good to guess. They were chivalrous. But aside from that, there's no civilization. These people are not civilized at all. Would that be a
Well,
fair?
they would have you believe that the only two redeeming qualities that the Arabs had was, one was their poetry and the second was their generosity and nobility. That was it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So there was nothing there. There was no prior civilization. Had they only read Roman and Greek historical texts, and they would have known how much of a civilization there was actually there in those areas. So, it's like the antithesis. So, we are Muslims, we are people of light, and the exact opposite of us was darkness, barbarianism, Jahiliyyah, ignorance, eating of carrion and killing, which I still haven't understood, by the way, eating of carrion. And burying our daughters, which wasn't as widespread as they would have you believe, and all of these sort of things. So it's a quick brush, to kind of wash away what you don't know and say, okay, well, now listen to what I do know, which is the narrative of the seerah, which is only on the religious level. Right.
Okay.
So even when they're analyzing Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they're not analyzing him as a man. They're analyzing him as the protected prophet of God. Right. So when we look at, okay, so when he planned Badr, how did he win? How could they win Badr? Everybody will turn around and say, oh, that was an act of God. Allah was behind him. Yes, the faithful believe that. I have faith. I believe that as well. But what about the decisions, the agency of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? He made those decisions. What were those decisions? Let's analyze him as a man. Right? I'll give you one example. Now, this kind of irked me, and it still does irk me. The Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he went and he took over the wells. Now, if you study his, if you look at the Battle of Badr, it's amazing. And if you look at the analysis that people give, you're going to roll your eyes again, thinking, "Oh my God, how poor is it?" So he took command. Like, you have the wells of Badr. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam got there first, right? He left the wells exposed and took up position behind the walls, right? So that means now the enemy is going to come and they have access to water. But in war, you don't want that. You want to starve them out. You want to weaken them so you can beat them, right? This is common sense. So then the question arises, did the Rasul not know that? Yani, even a layperson will know during war, let's deprive them of everything, right? It's an assumption, right? So then you're forced to question, but did the Rasul not know that? Nobody's answered that question, right? And they actually make it worse, but not answering it. Why? Because one of the companions, I forgot his name, he turned around and said, Ya Rasul, he says, He says, was it Allah that told you to put your camp behind the wells, or is this your own decision? He says, it's my own decision. He said, okay, if it's your own decision, I would say, take the wells, deprive them of the water, because it makes sense. And the Rasul did that. Right. So there's two questions here. One of the understandings, well, I've never heard an understanding of why Rasul never took those wells, right? Because if a sheikh cannot, if an Islamic so-called seerah scholar cannot answer that question, he's going to put doubt into your head that Rasul was unable to understand a simple concept of war, which is take the wells, right? If you give up the wells, they're going to have access to water. They could deprive you of the water. Right. But then one understanding I heard from someone who I highly value, he says the generosity of Rasul in wartime was so, even in wartime, was so great that he didn't want to deprive his enemy of water even. Right. Now that's one understanding. Right. It may be true. It may be his understanding. Until I don't see the source material, I'm on the fence.
It's an interpretation, yeah.
Yes, an interpretation. I would like to think that was true, but there could have been another interpretation. Or it could have been even, for example, that Rasul had, there's a lot on his mind going on. You're on your limited force and your ragtag army, and then you've got other warriors coming, fully armed, coming to fight you. So, let's just settle down first. Let's work out our bearings, and then we're going to work out what to do through consultation. That could have been a reason, right? Because I don't believe that Rasul didn't know that there's a well there. I should capture the well, right? But if no Islamic scholar is going to teach you that, you're going to be forced to maybe believe that Rasul didn't know this, right? So there are glaring facts. The Sirah is full of them.
But this requires, sorry to cut you off, this requires, what you're applying here is strategic knowledge of battlefield formation, battle strategy.
Of course.
So it requires another discipline, in parts, to analyze one specific segment of Sirah, which is to do with the warfare strategy. And so this would then actually push to the next topic, which I guess to the next thought, which would be, I guess, is it sufficient just to read the Sirah? Obviously not. Okay, we need other sides, other disciplines, other sciences. You've mentioned this being one of them. Another one is, you could also mention sociology, economics, politics. There are many different disciplines and sciences that would have to be utilized to dissect and to begin questioning in a more detailed, at a more detailed level, what we're reading or we're receiving. And as you've said, sometimes it's only from the religious lens that we're looking at things, which is it is an essential lens, but it is just one of the lenses you need in order to have the full vision of what you're actually reading. So the example you gave is a great example, but I'd like to give you another example that potentially you could tell me whether or not you think it is taught appropriately when we look at Sirah. Yeah. So you mentioned the pre-Islamic era being written off effectively as just a blank slate. Islam arrives, everything flourishes, and so we're led to believe that the Arabs as a people really had nothing going, and that literacy was low, culture was low, everything was low. But if we take that perspective and we internalize it, it can create very difficult conversations and very biased perspectives. I've heard people say to me, literally, the Arabs with no Islam are animals. They have nothing. They are just what they were before Islam, which was nothing. And I disagree completely, because one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was an Arab one, Petra. The Nabateans were Arabs. And if you go to the southern region in the Himyarite kingdom and the Sabaetic kingdom, they've got alphabets. Right? They've got the alphabets that they had, their own indigenous alphabet. They had a language. They had the dam of Ma'arib, which was one of the greatest dams in antiquity. So I think there is a risk if we over-essentialize pre-Islamic Arabia in order to augment the effect of Islam's arrival, that in an indirect way we're kind of doing a disservice to the Prophet ﷺ and his people, right? Because we're casting a light upon them that actually that's not how it was. And I would argue the opposite, that they were advanced. in many ways. And because of that, because if you look at, I'll give you a framework of reference, it's all going to make sense in one moment. Ibn Khaldun talks of decadence being the final phase of any dynasty of people's development, right?
Yes.
It begins
Yes.
with barbarism or barbarity, savagery. It becomes a sedentary society, then it becomes decadent, right? And then it's destroyed. So the argument that I'm hearing when I read Sirah in English, I read in Arabic as well, but in English, is that these were barbaric people. Yeah? So they began their development curve with barbarity. Islam came and then it went to the peak of civilization. But my argument is that no, actually, when Islam came, it already gone from barbarity to sedentary, and now it was at the phase of decadence, which is not a lack of civilization. It's just that the civilization itself has come to the point where it's so decadent that it needs revival. So they didn't lack civilization. They didn't lack culture. What they lacked were the moral principles that would balance what they were enjoying. So that's the perspective I'm looking at. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you feel that potentially maybe they were? I don't know.
It's interesting what you just said. I never actually thought of it that way before, but now that you've said it, it actually makes sense on a microcosmo level. And just taking your idea a bit further here. So also, don't forget, in those towns we had Jews and Christians, right? And Jews and Christians are harbingers of civilization. Jews and Christians have knowledge.
Yes.
They're connected with greater civilizations, and their priestly class is always literate, always has been. So they could read and write. So are you telling me that they were living, cheek by jowl, they were living next to Arabs, pagan Arabs, and nothing rubbed off? No education rubbed off, no ideas rubbed off, no greater thinking rubbed off. And the Arabs that traverse from north to south and from south to kind of northeast, to Al-Hira and then the Persian, they didn't learn anything en route. Isn't travel the veins of the spread of knowledge are the travel routes, right?
Yes.
And you're saying Mecca was a locus, right? So and also going by the argument you said that it was the final decadent stage. People, we should never look at the past with our lens today. So, for example, I'm sitting here today, and if we're told that Abu Sufyan's cloth was, example, brocade, and it was this, and Abu Lahab's clothing and their houses were so fine, they probably weren't as good as what I'm wearing today. My chair is more comfortable than his chair. In fact, my IKEA chair today is more comfortable than many a king in the past.
Kings, yes.
Right? What's that place? Primark. My Primark clothing today is of more high quality than many a clothing of a chief in the past. Right? That's just a given. Everything we have is more luxurious, more finely developed. So we shouldn't look at it in that lens, but we look at it comparatively with their civilizations back then. So if we take Mecca, taking your argument, so we had the Hadara, the civilized Arabs who were in the cities, and then the Arab al-Ba'ida, the Arabs who were from the Barri, who were from the like the Bedouins, right? So yeah, they're going to be uncouth. We know that. Sirah mentions that. We know that they were uncouth because deserts, Bedouin people, far from civilization, and even today you can go and see the Bedouins are uncouth. The civilized people in the cities, comparing this Mecca, don't compare Mecca to Damascus or Mecca to Al-Hira or Mecca to whatever Jerusalem or Busra, or compare Mecca to a desert enclave, and a tiny oasis of civilization. And for its time, it was highly developed. So the Arab pagans, the businessmen, had become so rich through trade that they became decadent, right? And a decadent person is someone whose stomach is full, his hormones are flowing, and he's thinking, how am I going to satisfy my lusts now, right? And that's what they did, right? The feasting, the sexual depravity, the feasting, the boasting. The Quran mentions this, the Sirah mentions this, and every single work on Jahiliyyah mentions this as well, right? So this is what Islam came to destroy. And the Rasul ﷺ said, he says, I've come to perfect good manners. He didn't say, I've come to teach you good manners. I've come to give you good manners. I've come to perfect. That means they already had a standard.
Yes.
Right? They already had a standard of some sort of nobility, largesse, generosity, like etiquettes of living. And the Rasul ﷺ came to raise that bar, right? To perfect it to its ultimate perfection. So it's an interesting insight what you just said, but an ancillary follow-up from that is what I just concluded, and I would absolutely agree with you that on a macrocosmic scale, that they had civilization, and they had estates. We know that they had estates in Damascus. We know that they had estates in Taif, and
Yes.
Damascus is a place of civilization.
Well,
we even know that they went as far as Abyssinia, and Abyssinia, Habasha, and Egypt is another was back then a hub of civilization. So of course they were civilized. They brought those civilized things, the ideas, way of reclining, living, and artifacts back with them.
Well, they even had
right?
in the Kaaba, according to some of the early sources, there were pictures of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus among the relics that they brought back into because they wanted to diversify the market, right? So,
of course,
to a certain degree, there were some Christians who would also come to visit the Kaaba because those relics were there. So, again, I think it's very simplistic to just say there was nothing there. Islam comes, these people I liked what you mentioned about eating a lot, and that has effects on the body and on the mind, because when we talk of promiscuity and certain acts of, you could almost say, excess, squandering of wealth, it's not from people who have nothing or are savage. It's from people who have got too much of something.
not too much.
Exactly, which fits again to the Chaldean model of when you get too much food, increases, sexual desires diversify, and you have decadence. So rather than being, you could say, a ground zero project, Islam was like a renovation project. The house was going down. Let's just patch up. Let's build it again. Yeah, to kind of to complement what you mentioned. Yeah. So, but I think it has an important impact on how we think in the modern world today, because when we say Jahiliyyah, when we think pre-Islam, we tend to have a very dismissive attitude, and that affects, from my perspective again, not only the Arab culture and civilization, but any culture that has embraced Islam in history. We tend to write off everything before that and just think that, well, there was nothing there. It wasn't worth learning anyway. It was just pagan. Jahiliyyah, that's the term, right? Jahiliyyah is like one term that just erases everything. And we begin our story when Islam arrives.
Year zero.
Year zero, yes. And from personal observation and study, I feel that Islam, it accentuates any civilization that it comes in contact with. And rather than cutting off your lineage, your heritage, your history, you should look back and, comparatively speaking, what did we have before Islam? How did the best of what we had get even more beautiful when Islam arrived? And that's an organic way to kind of not only inherit Islam as a gift to mankind, but also just to appreciate the fact that, yeah, there was civilization before Islam. It doesn't have to be 0 to 100.
There's two interesting points on that. One is, if you Kitab al-Buyud, the books of trade, if you study Qaduri's manual on trade, and it's probably the most dry subject, especially for me when I was studying it. It was the most dry subject, and it's got no relevance in my life, because I'm not a business person by any stretch. But it's interesting because he mentions one way of sealing a sale. So if I go to like a massive stall in a traditional bazaar, in a traditional souk, you have like big stalls, and I can get a stone, right, and throw a stone at the item that I need. And if it lands on wherever it lands, that's mine. That sack or that fruit or whatever it is, that's my that's our sale there, right? And that sounds very strange. Islam could have said, well, you know what, that's like, it sounds a bit, like wrong. We're going to do away with that, and you're going to shake on it. No, Islam said, well, if that's the way you trade it, bring it on. Do you know what I mean? So it's in the books now. And then if we look at the pagan months, the Arab calendar, the pre-Islamic calendar, Rasul, he fixed on his last Hajj He says time has come circular and back to where it started, and today the calendar is fixed, and there shall be no more nasi. There's no more intercalculation of the calendar, playing with the calendar, making one month holy and another month that wasn't holy, unholy, that was holy, unholy. So you could fight and play around with the Islamic holy months. So, but the names weren't changed. Right? And the names actually betray the fact that this was a calendar that had been intercalated. Because, Rabi and Zulqa'dah and all these names, like the first rain is in spring, right? But our Islamic calendar, it cycles through a 33-year cycle through the heavens, right? To match up the sun, the Gregorian.
Yes.
Yeah, the lunar solar year. It's a 33-year cycle. That means that the first rains are not going to fall in the month titled Rabi every month. It's going to change, right, over 33 years. But for the Arabs to call it a Rabi means that you fixed that calendar where it was always raining at that month, right? But Islam never came and said, okay, well, now you know what we're going to do with everything. I've given you a new calendar, right? No more playing with the calendar, and let's name it year 0 and 1, 2. No, they said keep the names. Keep the names.
That's a profound point you've made there, because if we take it from that perspective and we draw it down to the individual experience, when I become Muslim, the first thing people ask is what's your Muslim name, right? It's as if the history of who you were, the lineage you've inherited, ground zero, right, year 0, as if that Jahili past we tend to undermine and kind of dismiss it as Jahiliyyah. So there's a matter in year 1, 0 to 1. And I think that does more harm to an individual than it could do any good. Yes, because you don't have any sense of roots. Yeah, a tree without roots will always fall. So I think personally that we need to spend more time studying pre-Islamic Arabia before we delve into the seerah. And I believe it's just as important to get the setup right before you get into the main narrative. It's very important because in the way I've read it, many things make a lot more sense when you understand the pre-Islamic era. As you mentioned, 150 years, 200 years, roughly around that time, a lot makes sense, honestly, because it's like reading a book. You jump straight to the middle chapter and you want to read to the end. You've missed a lot of setup and character developments, so that in the latter chapters, there are certain details, finer details that you will not appreciate because you don't know the background behind why this detail is so important. So the pre-Islamic epoch, 150 years, 200 years, there is a lot of amazing insight that I think is missed because we simply say, it doesn't matter, it was all Jahiliyyah, they were killing children and just, that was it, savagery. Why do you think that's typically the way we teach or we learn seerah, the year 0 kind of outlook, and how can we cure it? How can we fix this?
It's interesting what you just said. You gave your own analogy where you just said that when someone becomes a Muslim, that's their year 0, ground zero. Everything before that was Jahiliyyah for you, right? Yes. So if we take that paradigm that we've established for Jahiliyyah for the Arab world and juxtapose it on you now, say you became a Muslim yesterday. So by rights, you should forget who your mother is, your father is. You should forget everybody. You should forget
some people do
everything.
That. Some people do
they
that.
Do, yeah. They do, yeah.
Literally.
Which is a tragedy.
Yeah. But they believe, because it is really a powerful point, actually, this idea of Jahiliyyah, because you're almost disavowing yourself. You're almost disavowing yourself, your old self, as not important and almost non-existent. So when you begin from nothing, it's no wonder why we have people who have identity crises.
This is what happens. This is why Jahiliyyah is so important to, you would think if the Arabs were so disgusted with it and wanted to cut it off like a poisoned stem or like a poisoned root, then why were they so fascinated with it? They were so fascinated, through the best part of 1,000 years up to the Ottoman era. The Arabs were fascinated with their own Jahili past. Why? Because, like you said, a tree without roots is going to fall over. It has no basis. It doesn't even know why it's growing, where it came from, and where it's got to get. It's your nutritional base. Islam is the water on top of the tree, but the nutritional base is your lineage, your prehistory, right? That's where you derive your strength from. And Islam is just the external, that kind of the external agent that helps you grow in a better way, in a cleaner way. It's clean water. But Islam never did away with its prehistory. I think we did that as Muslims, as a natural reaction, as a natural reaction that, oh well, we're Muslims now, and everything else. Number one, they didn't record it till about 200-300 years later. So when it comes to Jahiliyyah can be summed up, by the way. There are many different ideas of Jahiliyyah, but the strongest idea that I take, and the simplest idea that I take, is living in a time without knowing properly who your creator is and how to worship him. That's my statement on Jahiliyyah. So, and that puts you far from the mercy of Allah. So being heedless of who your Lord is properly, right? That's the biggest, act of Jahiliyyah that you've done to yourself, or that you're in now, the state that you're in. Everything else is like secondary, tertiary, like stuff like, okay, because we don't know who our Lord is, we don't know how to deal with certain things in society properly. Yes, we have nobility, but sometimes we forget our nobility and we end up taking vengeance in a way that is not justified. Islam came and stopped that. Yes, certain tribes, and it wasn't all tribes, by the way. Now, like the concept of Jahiliyyah for everybody is they're going to say, oh yeah, the Arabs, they're going to paint them with one brush.
Yes.
All Arabs were barbarians. They used to kill their daughters. They used to eat carrion. They would marry willy-nilly, left, right, and center. They would marry their mother-in-laws. They would seek vengeance, and
they were illiterate.
They were illiterate. They were utter barbarians, right?
Yes.
Now, some elements of that, to a certain percentage, in certain areas of society, yes, it's true. And you know what? It holds true for us today in our society, Muslim and non-Muslim, right? So a thought question would be, killing your children, would it be worse for a barbarian to do or a civilized Roman to do? You would think, yes, it's bad. Across the spectrum, it's bad. But you would say, well, the civilized the Roman should have known better. He had access to more wealth, some sort of social welfare, a better legal code, better measures put in place, and a better state economy. He didn't need to do that. But the Arabs had nothing, so they would do that, right? But the truth is that the Arabs did it, the Romans did it. In fact, every civilization on earth did it, and they're still doing it. How many thousands of babies in India, in Africa, in China? Jahiliyyah as a concept hasn't left us, right? There will always be elements of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is basically an understanding of your Jahl, understanding of your Jahl state, and then trying to move away from it. Whereas before, we didn't have the understanding of it. And this is leaving aside like 1,000 years of scholarship on what the Arabs thought Jahiliyyah was. And so, as you mentioned, so they believed this. Why in the early period did they believe this? Because very quickly they became so-called civilized, right? So all of a sudden the Arabs pushed forward into the world's most civilized areas, and they've always been forward-looking. They didn't look back. For 100 and 150 years, they didn't really look back.
Let me throw a spanner. Let me throw a spanner, because you're building a very interesting point here. So the civilizing agent is Islam, obviously, right?
Yes.
They suddenly just everything awakens in them. They've seen the lights. Literacy goes up. Society, culture, everything explodes. Right? That's the train we're on right now. Okay. But you mentioned something. You said they never looked back. Someone may say, well, there's a famous statement of Sayyidina Umar, who said that before Islam, we were nothing. We were abased. We were people who were, Islam gave us izzah. That's typically what you hear in defense of that narrative, that we were nothing before Islam. Islam became something. That's a typical response. How would you respond to that? Because
that's compared to number one, nothing can overtake the fact that now you know your Lord as he should be known. So that's your biggest gift. So if you look at Jahiliyyah compared to that, yes, we were nothing. Doesn't matter how rich we were or how our civilization was. We were heedless of our Lord. We had nothing. That's a valid interpretation, by the way. And then the second thing is that Islam was a civilizing force on us. So slowly, we moved away from many of the things that we did, right? And we just carried on moving forward. So of course we're gonna say today that we are where we are because the initial injection given was Islam, right? So this is the problem with the understanding of Jahiliyyah. There are many interpretations to Jahiliyyah. You can take there's Jahiliyyah mentioned in 4 times, I think, in the Quran in a certain way. There's Jahiliyyah mentioned by the companions in ways like you've said, and then later scholars have always given it their own twist, right? So like 150 years later, once the dust had kind of settled, and they're thinking, right, okay, now what do we do, right? Then like you said, no human being can be cut off from his roots. If you're cut off, you're lost. So the Arabs had to then look back. Now they're developing as a civilization. They're coming into contact with the highly developed, Greco-Roman world, and then the Persian world, and then the Indian world, and they've got to give answers.
And
These
Chinese world.
highly civilized, these highly civilized people they're coming across with like 2,000 years of civilization that's there in the monuments and in the literature. You can see it. Now they're having to look back and say, well, where did we come from? Right, okay, So then they're having to backtrack, and there's a nostalgia for past times now.
You mean
Right,
pre-Islam?
yes,
Really?
pre-Islam, pagan,
Wow.
pre-Islam.
So let's
Yes.
explore this a bit more. So which aspects of the Jahili culture or epoch did the early Muslims not aspire towards, but have a melancholic attachment to, or perhaps a scholarly attachment to? Because we know there is a study, a thorough to this day, by the way, when we look at tafsir, grammar, language, the pre-Islamic epoch poetry is still studied. It's mandatory, in fact. So which aspects of that pre-Islamic epoch are you referring to in terms of looking back and trying to kind of, I guess, not reclaim, but at least hold on to a bit of,
Identify stronger
yeah,
with.
yeah,
Yeah. The very same thing that Islam came to nullify, which was the Jahili concept of tribal society. So we're talking raiding, we're talking boasting of lineage, we're talking about these kind of things. So, like you said, pre-Islamic poetry, right? We've kept hold of that. Now, there's two schools of why we kept hold of that. One of them is like the scholarly, the highly religious scholarly class that kept hold of the poetry, for all its lewdness and for all its the bad things in there. They just kept it as a linguistic source for understanding obscure words in the Quran.
okay.
And then like formulating grammar structures, understanding why certain grammar structures were used the way the eloquence, the peak of eloquence at that time, why it was done, to understand that.
So there was,
Okay, fair enough.
there was a benefit in maintaining, you could say,
Yeah.
the linguistic register of the pre-Islamic Arabs. Although, as you mentioned, the poetry is somewhat licentious and lewd, but it's still beneficial in that sense, right?
Yes, but then there's the other part, right? Which is the nostalgia now, right? That we were pagan Arabs. Look at our poets. Look at our raiding. Look at our beautiful camels. Look at how generous we were feeding everybody. Look at my tribe. Yeah, look how I am, the honor of my tribe. Where I go, my tribe goes. And if my tribe is not there, I'm alone enough to defend them. And if I have to die defending my tribal honor, even if they're wrong, so be it. I am that man. This is complete Jahiliyyah, right? But they kept this. And it's interesting. See, this is now where Jahiliyyah, the idea splits into 1,000 branches. Each generation took ideas of Jahiliyyah to forward their own agenda, right? So, like for example, the late Umayyad period, right? So they took Jahili poetry to forward their goals. Then the Abbasids, and then the Abbasids didn't do it as a counter, because some poetry you'll see they're bringing up old poetry which bring up rivalry which happened hundreds of years ago with tribal names. But some, like especially with the Abbasids, right? You've got a Persian bed of civilization which the Arabs have just sat on top of, and you've wholesale adopted Persian culture. Why? Because you don't really have a strong, your own culture is Bedouin, right? So you've adopted it now, but you're insecure, right? So the Persians are looking down upon you and saying, well, like a generation or two ago, we were your overlords. and we would give you our scraps. And today you're lording it over us on what basis? What? And you still hear this from Persian speakers to this day, by the
There's
way.
Persian pride, yes, there is that.
Yeah. So then the Arabs, then the Abbasids had to say, well, this is who we are. You forgot Al-Hira. You forgot that the all of these poetry. It was the Lakhmite kings, the
Yes.
famous kings of that they patronaged this poetry. Right? They would have this lavish courts on the fringes of the Persian Empire, and they would have these poetry competitions and the best poets, and and it was preserved by them as well, right? So they had the Abbasids obviously being the successors to them, you can say, the army and the elites and the generals and the governors and people like that. We're not talking about the main kings and everything. So obviously they would then put that forward and say, have you forgotten who we are? We are the people that you needed as your helpers. Without us being in the vanguard of your army, you had nothing, and we defeated you, right? So they kept that Jahili tradition alive, and then they would use it in their internal politics every generation or so, by giving it a different twist. So this is why we have different understandings of Jahiliyyah. Some of them would say, yeah, we were zero. We started from some of them. Some of them would say we were. Some of them would say exactly what the Afghans say today. So if you go to an Afghan, when did you become Muslim? Oh, some of them will say we were always Muslim. But then when you actually say, sit down, calm down, relax, drop the emotion,
A lot of
but
people say
you're not an Arab, and even the Arabs weren't even Muslims, they had to be converted. So then when he understands that, he says, oh yeah, well, when it came here, we were the first to accept without hesitation. That's what
hmm
they'll say,
Many people
right?
claim that, by the way.
Yeah, many people claim that. The Somalis claim that as well,
Yes.
right?
Many
Right.
people claim
So
that. They go back to saying Nuh, Noah. We're Muslim from Noah all the way down.
exactly, right? So then, like some of the Jahili scholars who tried to understand Jahiliyyah would actually purport this. They would say, "Well, you know what? It wasn't ground zero, especially when it came to faith. We were already monotheistic, right? But harmlessly, we were led astray, and circumstances happened, and idols ended up in the haram, and we still believed in Allah, but somehow." Innocently we started worshiping idols. See, they give the key words are in there, the text. You got to analyze the text.
Yeah,
Like we just happened to, without realizing, ended up on the wrong path, right? So they try to give you like it's like saving face. It's like giving some sort of claiming back something from Jahiliyyah that was worthy of showing to the rest of the world. But then other scholars would say, no, it was completely zero, right?
darkness.
But to be honest with you, it wasn't completely zero. It was a highly developed, highly civilized for its time, its place.
It couldn't
And
be
and then
completely zero.
if somebody turns around and says, "Oh well, then why didn't Alexander the Great invade? Why didn't the Romans invade? Why didn't the Persians?" That's a different story. That's got nothing to do with its own place in history. It's a fascinating area, and there's a lot of research to be done, and there's still a lot of research coming out. And this is why, as you said, you need to have a basis, a grounding in the pre-history of like the 150 years prior to, and a proper grounding, because it sets the context, right? Otherwise, you're going to learn, like, you don't know why Rasul made certain decisions. You can
Yes,
only know them if you know his society.
absolutely. And I think it's really a thrilling discussion here. It's on a personal level. I think when I look at the Sirah, I'll give an example. When I read the Sirah, I look at it as like it's a biography, it's a journey, as you mentioned. It's a beautiful analogy, but it's also a representation of myself. Yeah, my journey in Islam, to Islam, the beginning. The first, at least I would say, the first 3 chapters should be the preamble. I want to know, how did I get to the point where the gift of Islam was unwrapped upon me, right? I don't want to just go straight. There was 1 page, nothing happened, and then suddenly you've got 10 chapters of all this amazing stuff, right? So that preamble, that initiation process is very important. And I find that sometimes the books I'm reading in English, because the Arabic text have a very lengthy preamble.
But you know what? The preamble is still very weak, by the way, right? The English preamble and the Arabic preamble. Let's take Ibn Hisham, Ibn Hisaq for an example. Okay, one thing before that. I've seen somebody give a preamble taking it all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar.
Mm.
I
There
mean,
are there are there are problems with I guess the historians, the Muslim historians, historiographers, and technically there are errors. There are errors in terms of how they describe the king. Sometimes the kings are just mischaracterized. It's the wrong epoch. It's anachronistic. But there is an attempt, nevertheless. The point is, there is an attempt to cover a vast space of time before you get to the 𝗣𝗢𝗓. This is when the Prophet there's an
They're
attempt.
filling in. They're just filling in the blanks. That's what they're trying to do with whatever information that they can acquire. So when you've got nothing to say, you're going to say, "Well, I'm going to hit Nebuchadnezzar." Nebuchadnezzar has got nothing to do. He was pre the Arabs by 1,000 years, and he wasn't even an Arab, and nothing he ever did had an effect on the Arabs. And when you're giving his name in the Arabic rendition, Bakht Nasr, Bakht Nasr, Bakht Nasr doesn't mean anything. Had you given the name Nabu Kedu,
Nabu is one of them.
Yes. Yeah, Nabu Keru, I can't remember his name.
Nabu is one of them anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So like someone like Nibodinus, Nabu Naed. Yeah. So these names, Nabu is one of their gods, right? So Kadir and whatever he's, Nabu Kadir is I forgot the suffix. So just give the proper name. Now then somebody who has an interest will then do his research and think, okay, because the name says it all, right? So you're talking about a deity that doesn't belong in the pantheon of the Arabs, right? Yeah. So then, then the one who wants to join the dots will think, why did you mention that? And then he does his further research and says, well, I'm going to disregard that because there's no dots to join on that line. So as you said, the preamble, I'm going to give an example. Ibn Hisham, his preamble is Abraha, right? And the Abyssinian invasion of the Himyarite kingdom. Right, that serves in my research absolutely no purpose, no relevance to the Seerah. Right, so I don't know why he did that. He's mentioned certain wars that were undertaken by the Habasha people and with the Himyarite mercenaries moving up into the Medina area. None of that serves any purpose in the Seerah. Right, but had he mentioned stuff like the weakening of the Ghassanids, the Ghassanid involvement in Medina or Mecca and trade, right? The Lukhmites or the Persian, like very late in the day, the Persians took dominance over the Yemen from the Persian Gulf side and from the other side. These are events that are immediate to the life of Rasulullah. Why? Because we know that the Persians and the Romans. See, this is another question that comes in the Seerah. Why would Rasulullah, it's like a death wish. You're sending an army out to Mut'a to fight the Romans, right? That's like a death wish, like the world superpower and your ragtag army. But there's reasons for that. There's the story in the Seerah of where when the king found out that there's a upstart in Arabia, right? And obviously the king sent down 2 people and said, bring him to me. So a person who doesn't know history would think, well, why would one of the preeminent kings of the world, the Persian Shahanshah, right? Why would he be worried about somebody who we thought was a Bedouin from the desert? But obviously you would think why, but he will be worried. Why? Because he's thinking it's these same people that bring up movements and strengthen them, and tomorrow we've got a problem on our borders. Right? So it makes sense that he's gonna do that. But those Ibn Hisham didn't mention any of that. Ibn Ishaq, right? So those are the things that you need to mention that have a direct relation with the Seerah, right? The Roman, more about the Roman Empire, more about pre-Islamic society. If you took the effort of writing about Abraha, which served no purpose in the story, like not Abraha directly, but whatever happened before, then you could have gone to the effort and spoke a bit about what society was like Jahiliyyah, if you want to know.
I think as we explore this theme in a more wholesome way and look at different ways of analyzing, interpreting, even questioning, a lot more can be unearthed. Many insights come out of it, many different things come out of it. And I think that's where we get to where we began this discussion. It's not just a dry topic. To engage with the Seerah is something that takes a lot more thinking, a lot more commitment, a lot more insight, perspective. It's not just a rendition of a story from A to B, chapter 1, chapter 2, the ending. happily ever after. It's a far more profound experience, and it takes several readings, because you may learn something in, let's say, in economics that you can apply to the seerah. When we look at the economic
Sure,
order in Mecca
sure, yeah.
before Islam became prevalent, and the concerns they had for the economy in Mecca, that was a major theme. So we can apply that there. When we look at, for example, anthropology, we can look at certain customs in that region, and certain developments we've actually we can inherit today from science and sociology. We can apply to that as well. So there is a lot, so much space and so much opportunity to delve deeper in the seerah and to explore in a far more meaningful way. And I think that we've discovered a lot today. We discussed a lot as well. And it'd be amazing to continue this line of inquiry and discussion in terms of seerah.